Welcome everyone to another episode of Flourish FM. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted to bring you an episode where we interview Emily Esfahani Smith. This was a fascinating interview. Emily is a writer based in Washington, D.C. Her 2017 book, The Power of Meaning, develops an account of meaning, and she argues that meaning should be the main source through which we seek in order to, if you like, live flourishing lives. And that was something we discussed in detail with her today. In addition to her work in The Power of Meaning, she's also given an extremely popular TED Talk, which has been viewed over 9 million times. There's more to life than being happy, and that's based on her book.
Yeah, I think, John, that TED Talk and the idea of distinguishing meaning from happiness was probably one of the highlights of the book and of our conversation with her. But I also really love, you and I talk about meaning and purpose a lot, but the way she breaks down meaning into these 4 components, right, or 4 pillars, as she put them, and then talks, tells us and tells the listeners how to cultivate some of those was really helpful, and I think really a highlight for me. What about you?
I loved the idea of this meaning mindset that Emily writes about in the book, and how we can cultivate that and what that involves, and the relationship between meaning with this interesting account having these what you call 4 pillars, and how that relates to human flourishing more broadly.
Yeah. So there's a lot to chew on in this episode, but some really good, tangible takeaways and action steps. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Emily Esfahani Smith.
Hello.
Good morning, Emily. How you doing?
Good. How are you guys?
Doing all right.
Very well,
thanks.
thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
Where are we finding you this morning?
Washington, D.C.
Okay. Do you live in D.C.?
I do. I do.
Okay.
Yeah. How about you guys? Where are you?
London right now. London. So it's actually late afternoon for me, 4:00.
Okay.
I am in Michigan at the moment. Currently a nomad, so I don't actually live anywhere, but home seeing family. So I have to tell you, I appreciated the zookeeper story because I'm a Michigan State grad 3 times.
Oh, wow.
I always like seeing an MSU shout out in there, especially for zoology.
Yeah. That was a fun. We that year, my husband and I were actually living in Michigan for his work for a year, so we got to explore the state a bit, which was a lot of fun.
Whereabouts?
In Ann Arbor.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
My wife's a Michigan grad as well. So.
Oh, okay, cool. So you commune with the enemy.
Sometimes. Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. We know how busy you are. Super appreciative. John and I both love the book and your TED Talk. And so we're excited to dig into this. And we've done, I don't know, a dozen of these so far, John?
Yeah.
But of all the ones that we've done, meaning and purpose consistently comes up, but we haven't dug deep. So I think we're both really looking forward to this conversation here. So.
Yeah. I just want to add, Emily, your book, I'm really in awe of it. It's fantastic. I love the way you write and the wide set of resources you draw on from literature, religion, world religions, philosophy, psychology. My background's in philosophy, so a lot of it resonated with me. And it particularly resonated with me when your kind of criticism of the way philosophy's gone in terms of how it deals with meaning these days. And I think you go over it. My only criticism of the book would be you're very kind to philosophy. You're kind. Academic philosophy needs to be returned, to the kind of questions you raise. You're philosophy doesn't do this anymore. But I think that's a bad thing about academic philosophy.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I'd love to at some point talk more about that.
Yeah, I absolutely loved your book. It's very inspiring, beautifully written, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you.
Thank you both. I've been looking forward to this as well.
Great.
Nice.
Well, we'll jump right in.
Okay, sounds good.
Great, cool.
Fantastic.
Okay, John, do you want to kick us off and get us going?
So, Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited for this conversation. And I want to kind of start off, we'd like to start off with digging into your background that led to your interest in meaning and your aim of showing how we can find a greater sense of meaning in our lives, which has ultimately led to your 2017 book, The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness, and your work since. So what led to your interest in this area and your aim of this kind of central aim of your work and perhaps your life?
Mm-hmm. Oh, first of all, it's so good to be here with both of you. Thank you, Nick and John, for having me. So there's really, I guess, 2 answers to that question. There's one that kind of reaches back more to my childhood, and then one that's related more to what I learned in graduate school. So I'll start with the latter. And when I was in graduate school, back in 2012, learning about positive psychology, which is the area of psychology that studies well-being, meaning, happiness, those kinds of topics empirically. I encountered, for the first time, I think, the work of Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor. And he wrote this beautiful book called Man's Search for Meaning, which was about his experiences in the concentration camps. And it's a book I highly recommend if, for those listening who haven't read it. But basically, Frankl talks about the importance of finding meaning in suffering. And he has this concept in the book called tragic optimism, which is, the ability to hold on to hope and meaning in life, despite the fact that life is full of suffering and loss and, grief. And, these are experiences that we will all have at some point or another. And so the ability to hold on to meaning and hope through that, I just found it really inspiring. And, at the same time, I was learning about, in that program about research, empirical research on meaning and happiness. And I came to see that they were separate ideas. And I hadn't really thought of them as separate ideas before. But as I kind of dug deeper into the research and also into Frankl's work, I saw that he too, and many other psychiatrists, psychologists of that era, talked about how there is this obsession with happiness in our culture in the more modern research. So that was kind of the beginning of what led me down the journey that led to the book. But I think that going back even younger, I had a very spiritual childhood. My parents were a Sufi. Sufism is a spiritual, mystical branch of Islam. And we lived in a Sufi meeting house. So I was like a meditation center, basically. So people, these spiritual seekers would come to our home and they would meditate for several hours, a couple times a week. And that was just, this idea of leading a meaningful life was kind of in the air. And I was surrounded by all these people who were committed to that and who many of them had led difficult lives. Some were refugees from the Middle East and things like that. And so, reflecting back on that experience when I was in grad school, there was this, I started thinking more about how, you can lead a good life, even if it's a hard life. So happiness might not be so central to a life like that, but meaning can be. And I just thought that was a really beautiful idea.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I mean, Viktor Frankl has come up a number of times in these conversations, unsurprisingly. So inspirational in flourishing research, particularly on the importance of hope and meaning, as you point out. And something that really, I think I speak on behalf of both Nick and I, really impressed us about your book was this wide array of sources you draw upon in your writing, particularly from philosophy, psychology, literature, and world religion. So you've mentioned Frankl and your upbringing. Are there any other major influences on your thought and work?
I would say that those are, that those two things are what, led me down this path of writing more about meaning. But I think definitely just, growing up, because I was interested in these big questions of meaning and, how do you lead a good life? I was drawn to studying philosophy in college. And so there, we were talking about this just a moment ago before the show, academic philosophy today isn't a place where questions of kind of meaning and value are as central as, those questions were kind of historically to philosophy. But still, when you kind of start digging into the field, you do come across thinkers who have taken up that question in a serious way. And so in my book, I write about the French philosopher Albert Camus and Aristotle, of course, who I bet is someone else who's also probably come up a lot in these shows because he's a central figure within positive psychology. So those are some others. And, some novels that I write about as well. I'll just mention one of them, the novel Middlemarch, I think is a beautiful kind of statement about how to lead a meaningful life. And I could go on about all of them, but I'll just stop there.
No, that's wonderful. I mean, these are some of the resources. I love the way you discuss them and intertwined them with the general narrative in your book. I mean, just a brief follow up to that. Do you think that an important way of finding meaning in our own lives is actually to read these canonical pieces of literature as a kind of source of, didactic inspiration and a means of living better lives? That we ought to be reading these texts as a way of finding in our own lives a sense of meaning?
I do think so. I think that, certainly, across the history of, education, especially higher education, a lot of these texts were central. They were considered, as you say, canonical, like part of a core curriculum. And that was in large part because, I think there were two reasons. One is because they were considered to hold like some of the greatest ideas of history. And, if you're going to be educated, like, you would want to know what those are, I would think. Mm-hmm. But also they are kind of manuals about how to live. And I think that that schools, especially institutions of higher education, used to take that idea of helping students figure out how to lead a meaningful life more seriously. And part of how they did that was educating them, in ideas, in kind of philosophers like Aristotle and, Shakespeare, these great works where all of them are really taking up like the question of like, how do you lead a good life? How do you, have good relationships? Like, what do you do when you're faced with loss? How do you make sense of this kind of complicated and terrifying world? So I think that there are a lot of answers in those books. And also I would say in religious texts as well. I once interviewed, as a journalist myself, I interviewed a woman, a scholar named Camille Paglia, and she said something that I've thought a lot about since, which is that, if we really want to give people a multicultural education and education multiculturalism, we should educate them in the world's religions, because that's where you really learn about culture. And I would say also about meaning.
Great. Yeah. I mean, your book serves in many ways. You could go through it and pull out kind of key texts that, a student ought to read through their education. I love, for example, your discussion of Tolstoy's A Confession quite early in your book. Anyway, I'm going to get lost talking about too much here because I loved your work, but I'm going to hand over to Nick.
I will too, because I have teaching certifications in the academic study of religions. My dissertation was on eudaimonia, so you're speaking my language big time here, and the book did as well. So I love where we've taken this. I'm going to pull us back for a second. And if we can just speak a little bit about the role of meaning in human flourishing. And then I think related to that, and you can kind of pick this apart in whatever order you want, but you do a great job of distinguishing between meaning and happiness, right? And I'd love for you to just kind of tease apart the dynamics between meaning, flourishing, and happiness, and how you think about those three constructs, if you would.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in talking about the role of meaning in a flourishing life, I'll go back to Frankl for a moment. So Frankl's signature contribution to the field of psychiatry and psychology was something called logotherapy, and logos is the ancient Greek word for meaning, so meaning therapy. And the idea behind it was that human beings have this need for meaning that's as vital to our psychological and spiritual health as the need for, food, water, and safety and shelter are for our physical well-being. And that without meaning, we suffer in profound ways. And so, so Frankl talks a lot about how we need a reason to live, a why to kind of move us forward. And in Man's Search for Meaning, he illustrates this by telling the story of two suicidal inmates that he counseled in the camps, kind of informally as a therapist. And for both of them, he said, restoring in them the will to live was a matter of getting them to see that there was still something waiting for them in the future, something expected of them in the future. So for one, it was the prospect of reuniting with his son, who was living in safety elsewhere in Europe. And then for the other, who was a scholar, an academic, it was, returning to his scholarship after the war. So I think that, meaning is that kind of why that gets us through, the good things, but also the bad things in life. It's vital to flourishing. If you, they're not always things that make us happy moment to moment, whether it's the work that we do or raising children or devoting ourselves to some kind of, political or social cause. But they give us this kind of sense of deeper satisfaction. And in terms of kind of pulling apart meaning, happiness, and flourishing, the way I think about it is, I guess like flourishing, I would think of kind of as the overarching construct, and meaning and happiness is kind of two approaches to leading a good life. Some people kind of are oriented towards the pursuit of happiness, and others are oriented towards the search for meaning. And meaning, the way that psychologists and philosophers define it, is as, the defining feature of a meaningful life is connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself, whether, again, it's the work you do, a community, God, nature. And so those things that kind of give your life a sense of significance and worth and purpose. And happiness, the way it's typically defined, and certainly the way it's measured in the research, is a positive mental and emotional state. So if you feel good, you're happy. If you feel bad, you're unhappy, and it comes and goes. So that's, I was talking earlier about some of the research on meaning and happiness. So part of what gets tricky with happiness is that because it does come and go, kind of building a life around the pursuit of it is inevitably going to cause problems for you, because it's not always going to be there. And that's what we see in the research, that when people kind of, devote themselves to the pursuit of happiness, that they, can feel unhappy, that it's not as lasting. Whereas meaning does kind of produce a flourishing life. And speaking of Aristotle and eudaimonia, I think Aristotle is another thinker to come back to here, because his idea of eudaimonia often gets translated as happiness. And so he says in the Nicomachean Ethics that the end of man, the purpose is of human life is to pursue eudaimonia, and that often gets translated as happiness. But that's not the true translation, I'm told, when I talk to kind of philosophers and scholars of the classics, that actually it's flourishing, and that flourishing, according to Aristotle, was about leading this kind of active life where you're realizing your potential and, activating your strengths and living a life of virtue. And that's much more consistent with a meaningful life than necessarily a happy life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Yeah, you hit on so many important points there. I often say to people, like, the chase of happiness, it's easy to become kind of the dog chasing its tail. Right. You never quite get there, so to speak. And I love the reference to, John and I talk about a lot of different sort of models or frameworks for flourishing. And I think you see some of the elements of both embedded, meaning and happiness embedded in these different frameworks, whether it's Harvard or Penn, PERMA, human flourishing, those sorts of things. Let's dig into what meaning is, right? And you do such a beautiful job in the book of kind of teasing out what you refer to as these 4 pillars of meaning, right? So you've got belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling. Would you, for our listeners, just kind of talk about each one of those pillars and how you feel that, or the research suggests that they contribute to an overall sense of meaning?
So when I was doing my research for my book, it's like you say, I wanted to know like what meaning is, like what do we have to have in our lives in order for our lives to feel meaningful. And so when I interviewed people about their stories and looked at the research, it was these 4 themes that I noticed again and again coming up. And so, with belonging, for example, that has to do with our relational nature as human beings. Human beings are social animals. And I think probably people listening to this podcast know that relationships are important for well-being and for flourishing. But for meaning, it's really about a certain type of relationship, one that's defined by a sense of belonging, or where you're valued for who you are intrinsically, and where you value others for who they are intrinsically. So really kind of seeing the other person, in and of themselves. Purpose is kind of relates to some of the things we were talking about with Frankl. It's that why, it's that thing that motivates you, that kind of pulls you into the future, your reason for living. So psychologists define it as a goal or a principle that organizes your life and that involves making a contribution to others. So it could be something like, finding a cure for cancer, or being a good parent, or being a kind person. So that's purpose. And then transcendence has to do with, these kind of wondrous experiences of awe, where you encounter something that kind of takes your breath away. And, mystics talk about how it puts you in touch with a reality that's more real than reality itself. There's something that just feels very true about them. So like looking up at the stars at night and reflecting on the vastness of the universe compared to your own puniness, being in nature, meditation, religious rituals. These are all ways that we kind of access the sacred realm and feel this kind of connectedness to something much larger than ourselves. And finally, storytelling is about how we make sense of our own experiences, the story that we tell ourselves about how we became the person that we are today, and about where we're going, and about also kind of how we make sense of the things that happen to us on a day-to-day level.
Perfect. I love that you mentioned earlier, connecting and contributing, right? Mm-hmm. And that you beautifully weave this relationship between, I think, like, you can't really have purpose without the belonging piece. I feel like, I think the research suggests that. I think you suggest that. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad you brought us back there. We had a conversation, we told you earlier this week, where we talked about a particular framework for flourishing that's missing meaning and purpose, but it's because it's oriented towards young people, right? And if we had time later, maybe we'll come back to that. And this particular guest suggested that it's not typically a huge priority for young people, but maybe that's something we can tease out. Yeah. But John, you want to take us in a different direction now?
Well, yeah, and I'd like just to ask a quick follow-up on this kind of quadripartite account of meaning. Are each of those constituents of meaning, do you on your account, do you have to have all of them to have meaning? Or if you have, a bit like positive psychology and kind of the PERMA model, Seligman doesn't say you have to have all of them. You can live what he calls like the accomplishing life, I think, or the engaged life, heavily with one of them, and that can still be flourishing. So on your view as well, can you have a strong sense of meaning by, let's say, having a very strong sense of belonging, but not much of the three, or a very strong active storytelling, but not much of the three, or maybe, but at least some of the three? How does that work?
No, it's a great question. And I would say that, yes, it is like PERMA in the sense that you don't necessarily have to have all four of those pillars to lead a meaningful life. But I will say that nearly everyone that I talk to, and when you look at the research, belonging comes up again and again. I think that if you don't have that sense of belonging, even if it's just with one or two other people, or just one community, that might be that could be more of a challenge in terms of feeling like your life is kind of full of meaning. The other thing I'll say is that even though you don't necessarily have to have all of these pillars in your life, it's, when you do encounter setbacks, or when one of those pillars that was important to you suddenly is no longer part of your life, because let's say you retire or you become an empty nester, these life changes. It's good to be able to then turn to another, pillar, so that you're kind of you're not living in a meaning vacuum all of a sudden because of these changes. And so it just kind of gives more, I guess, stability to the meaning structure if you have more than one pillar in your life. And then the other thing I'll say is that different people are kind of more oriented towards different pillars. So for some people, those relationships, that is really what kind of, lights them up. For others, it is more kind of their spiritual life and those moments of transcendence and wonder. So it can kind of be personal in that sense.
Okay, great.
Well, that's perfect. And you just used, I think, the key word that, we want to go to next, which is spirituality, right? So, this particular show is sponsored by the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, right? A big part of their model for human flourishing, and a lot of the writing that some of the people in their shop have done, is on this connection between, I think you could see different terms, spirituality, religiosity, those sorts of things. And again, in the opening chapters with your history and Sufism, you do a great job of tying this together. Will you tell our listeners a little bit about what you feel the role of spirituality or religiosity, however you want to conceptualize that, is in cultivating a meaningful life, or could be in cultivating a meaningful life?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that, one of the things that I did when I was writing this book was I spent a lot of time thinking about why it was that religion and spirituality are such powerful sources of meaning for people. And, if you kind of take the very long view of history, across thousands of years, the way that people found meaning and made sense of their lives and their experiences in the universe as a whole, their place in the universe was through, connection to the sacred, was through religious rituals, spirituality, whatever you want to call it. And increasingly, especially over the last several hundred years, the world, especially the developed world, has become more and more secular. And so that source of meaning that grounded our ancestors for thousands of years is no longer essential to people's lives today. And I think that's left a meaning vacuum. And as I was thinking about, where meaning comes from and why people don't have a sense of meaning today, like they used to, why so many people are living with an existential vacuum, I think it is because of that, absence of what religion provided for people. And I would argue that what it provided was kind of this structure that had all the four pillars in it. So, religion gave you a sense of belonging through the community, your community involvement. Sure. It gave you a purpose and, kind of advocating for a certain way to live your life and a certain way to be in the world. It gave opportunities for transcendence, of course, through rituals and practices like meditating or prayer or a liturgy. And then finally, it kind of gave you a story. It helped you make sense of the world and your place in it. So, now without that, for a lot of people, you have to kind of reconstruct it, I would say, for yourself. And that can be harder to do.
So that's where I was going to go next, is if we were trying to reconstruct it, or I like this phrase used a couple times, which is a meaning vacuum. Mm-hmm. How might we fill that vacuum if not through spirituality or religiosity? And I'm sure there's maybe many options, but if you've seen something in the research or your experience that it seems like people seem to be gravitating to when it's not religion?
I think definitely, work has become a substitute for a lot of people. Even this idea that, people are kind of seeking a calling in the work that they do, that, that's kind of been appropriated by, the secular world and by, people who study, meaning at work and meaning within organizations. But obviously that's a word that has kind of a religious connotation to it. But I think it just suggests, and Amy Wrzesniewski at Yale talks a lot about this, how the, in the absence of kind of religion as a source of meaning, people are increasingly turning to work and expecting that work might give them that sense of meaning. And, while on the one hand, I would say that, I think that there's an argument to be made that, nearly all kinds of work can give people a sense of meaning. I also think that it's putting a lot of pressure on yourself and on your work and on your relationship to work to kind of expect it to fill that existential vacuum. So I think that, work is certainly a place that we can turn to. And, I think being intentional about our relationships, our families, that's kind of something that we're all, we're born into, and then later on, if we choose to, we can have, for ourselves, the communities that we're a part of. And I think too, just taking time to, do some introspection when it comes to storytelling, for example, making sense of your experiences and the kind of person you are. So it is possible, to do these things. I'm not saying that if you do them on your own, it's necessarily going to fill that vacuum left by religion and spirituality. But I do think that there is kind of like a personal way that you can find a path to meaning.
Well, that word you mentioned there, introspection, I was just kind of thinking about it as you laid it out there, because it's always seemed to me that meaning and purpose is completely subjective, right? And so the book you talk about the stories we tell ourselves, and when it comes to work and jobs, you hear all these, I think, inspiring and beautiful stories about people doing jobs that I won't mention the jobs. I don't want to insult any listeners, but let's just say jobs that many of us probably might not find super meaningful or purposeful, but they're able to, right? Do you agree with that meaning and purpose are almost entirely subjective, and it really does often come down to this lens we take, what we spotlight, the story we tell ourselves?
Mm-hmm. So I would say that there's definitely like a mindset that you can have, like a meaning mindset.
Right.
We have a philosopher here. And so I don't, if meaning is completely subjective or objective, I think that's above my pay grade, I would say. But I think that, the attitude that we take towards the things that we do and the things that are happening to us can either help us build meaning in our lives or help us, cause meaning to kind of, fritter away from our lives. I'm just thinking of an example. You mentioned the thing about work, and one of the people I interviewed, who's actually part of this study that Amy Rajniewski at Yale and her colleagues had conducted at a hospital in the Midwest, and they were studying hospital cleaners. And with Amy's help, I was able to track down one of the cleaners, a woman named Candace, and Candace and I were talking, and she told me that she doesn't think about her job as I was mopping the floors and taking the trash out. She thinks about it as healing sick people. So she's part of this kind of larger mission of the hospital. And she kind of takes the, everyday tasks that she's doing, and she kind of sees them through that lens of meaning and purpose. And it kind of dignifies like everything that she's doing. And I think that attitude is an attitude that we can all adopt, whether we're like washing the dishes and doing chores or dealing with paperwork or, going through emails or whatever tedious things that, take up a lot of our day.
Yeah. It's funny. I want to give space to John to ask a follow-up, but it's a funny aside because I was just had a little bit of time to myself last night and was just kind of, scanning Netflix, and I saw this new show called Is It Cake? And in the preview, the whole premise is these people that make cakes look like other things, real life things. And in the trailer, one of the contestants literally says, he's like, it's just such a weird thing because there's people out there saving lives, and I've devoted my life to making cake look like other things. Right?
That's interesting. Yeah.
But he has a sense of meaning in it, some sort of sense of purpose and pleasure. So, but that's a great example of the folks, cleaning or mopping in the hospital. So perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. There's so many things I want to ask you, particularly about the meaning mindset. That was something we really wanted to dig deep on, but just one follow-up on the subjectivity of meaning here. Because you're very inspired by positive psychology and Martin Seligman's work. And he points out that meaning can't be entirely subjective in the sense that, he gives the example of Abraham Lincoln, who was, depressed and didn't find all of his actions meaningful, even though they clearly were. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering if maybe you see the relation as not two directional. So as it were, you can have, you can view your life as not meaningful, even though it really is. So you can be wrong in that sense. But the inverse doesn't hold, that you can find rich sources of meaning in anything. And it's not really the case. You can say to someone, no, what you're really doing is meaningless. If you add storytelling elements to it in the kind of examples you give that, I don't know, this has actually just occurred to me now, this idea, but yeah. I have a kind of a background view on meaning here. I'm asking if this is maybe something you've considered as to the level to which meaning is objective, but the relationship is maybe not two-way in the way I've described.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and thanks for reminding me of Seligman's example about Lincoln, because that is a good one. And I think in my writing, I encountered that kind of example a lot, that people not thinking that their lives are meaningful when, I think for an outsider looking in would say, no, like you're doing all these meaningful things, you're involved in all these meaningful projects and pursuits. You don't have to be like, ending slavery, but you are, still doing meaningful things. And, if it goes the other direction as well, I think that, one thing that's important to talk about with meaning is that, a meaningful life is one thing, and like a good life in the sense of a morally good life is another thing. And I think that this is somewhere where I, my kind of knowledge of philosophy and my just own powers of reasoning, I didn't really go there in the book to kind of sort out what is the overlap between a meaningful life and a moral life, because they don't always overlap.
Thank you very much, Emily. So let's go to the meaning mindset, because that is something we really want to dig into. And I think there's overlaps with various things you've said. So I'm very curious as to what exactly the meaning mindset involves. You've outlined various areas, but how we can cultivate this as well. And some points it seems to me that might contribute to it would be storytelling, that having a kind of a cultivating a meaning mindset is about creating a narrative that supports a sense of meaning in your life. In perhaps, and also having a sense of hope. So I can't help but compare it to the notion of a growth mindset with Carol Dweck, where in a certain sense that does involve a sense of hope. You see some skill as that which you can develop. So it's that you're hoping that with enough work you can do that thing. And it's also about telling a certain narrative of your life that, look, if I just keep trying at this thing, I will improve. And, it doesn't matter certain past events where I didn't show myself as being particularly skilled in this area, I can get this. You are telling a kind of narrative that helps support that in a different sense. So if you could explain kind of a little more what this involves and how exactly we can cultivate a meaning mindset.
I do think that kind of storytelling is an important part of it in the sense that, the mindset that you have. And I think that this is what Carol Dweck is trying to argue in her work is, anything that's happening in the world or is happening to you, it's just kind of a thing that's happening. And then you bring a perspective to it. And your perspective could be like, I'm never going to be good at math. Or your perspective could be like, this is really hard, but I'll get better if I keep working at this, to talk about growth mindset. I think that, with meaning too, it's similar. Like, things happen to you. And then one of the things that you can do is respond and choose how you're going to think about what happened to you. Just to go back to Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, he writes about how, everything can be taken from a person except their ability to choose how they make sense of their experiences. And so if we think about someone like Candace, doing work as a hospital cleaner, there was a number of different ways she could have made sense of that experience. But the story that she chose to tell was, I'm healing sick people. That's what my work is really about. So I think that storytelling, in the sense of framing, and telling a story about everything that you do, is definitely, a key way that we can develop a meaning mindset. And related to that, I think that, part of what a meaning mindset is recognizing that there are these kind of untapped sources of meaning that are all around us if we just kind of opened our eyes to them. And so having that, that filter, by which we kind of view the world, I think is another way that we can develop that meaning mindset.
Great. Thank you. It's a great notion. One that I really hope, catches on as much as growth mindset does. Nick, I've been getting.
I'd love to keep us on this thread here and go even deeper. And we might be kind of putting out our signature question too early here, but eventually we're going to ask you sort of, what do you think one thing is that people might do immediately to flourish? But before we get to that point, when it comes to leading a more meaningful life, when it comes to developing that meaning mindset, so I hear storytelling. What's an action step in your experience, or according to the research that anyone listening right now can kind of take today or tomorrow?
I think that, writing about your life experiences, journaling, there's a good deal of research showing that when we, especially the research that I'm talking about asks people to reflect on, upsetting experiences from their lives. So traumatic experience of adversity, and kind of writing about, their thoughts and emotions. And this is called expressive writing. And what researchers find is that if people do this for 15 minutes a day for 3 or 4 days in a row, that they end up developing a greater sense of meaning about what happened to them. They eventually kind of start making sense of it, and even are able to find some kind of silver lining, some way that they grew perhaps as a result of it. So that's kind of I'm specifically talking about, how you make sense of and make meaning of difficult experiences. But I think from that research, we can, pull out the idea of journaling in general and spending time, even if it's just a couple minutes, a couple times a week, just kind of writing about our what's happening to us. And, the researcher, Dan McAdams at Northwestern University, he writes a lot about and has done a lot of research on the narratives people craft about their lives. And one way that he, in his research, gets people to think about their life story is by asking them questions like, what was the high point of your life? What was the low point of your life? What were the turning points of your life? If you had to divide your life into chapters, what would those chapters look like? What are the themes that you see running through your life? And so I think those are questions that we can kind of ask ourselves too, as we, build this pillar of storytelling. And that journaling is one way that we can kind of, begin to unpack answers to those questions.
I love all those questions. So literally not just talking about storytelling sort of abstractly, but literally reflecting and turning your life into the story that it is, right? Or having this meta awareness of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And that,
beautiful.
And that relates to the next thing I'd really like to ask you, which and intertwines with a theme that comes up a lot in your book, which is education. And you seem to care very deeply about education and the way that it's gone, and give a very interesting account of the history of education, particularly in the last century. And I mean, you argue that an important role of education is to help students develop an understanding and vision of what is meaningful. But you draw attention to the fact that education has increasingly become, and still is becoming perhaps even more so, regarded as primarily instrumental. And that's led to a decline of what we might call education's meaning aim, developing a sense of meaning in our lives. Now, among the research you point to is survey data showing that in the late 1960s, 86% of US college freshmen reported that their top priority was developing a meaningful life philosophy, which has dropped by more than half since. So in what ways do you think education needs to change to fulfill its, what I've just called there, its meaning aim?
I think this is such a hard question, I think. There's, I know I'm going to kind of paint a picture of something that I don't know if it has the possibility of ever actually happening, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the idea that these colleges and universities create a structure for students and present them with a curriculum where they're learning and encountering ideas about what it means to lead a meaningful life. And I think that kind of making that a requirement, having a couple classes, and maybe one of them is a positive psychology class and a flourishing class. Maybe another one of them is a class on, the world religions or something like that. I think that, basically creating a venue for students to rigorously engage with the question of meaning and to learn about what other people, whether it's researchers or the great thinkers of the past, have said about this, to give them options about, what a meaningful life looks like and how they want to, which of those options they want to choose, I think is really vital. So I think having, some kind of curriculum around that. And I know that schools today increasingly are kind of offering classes on flourishing and the good life and things like that. And I think all of that's great. I think a lot of those classes are kind of taking students through positive psychology ideas and research. And obviously, I think that's great because my own background is in that. But I also think making room for the humanities too, those novels, those, religious and spiritual myths, those ideas from philosophy is really important because that's kind of the soul of it. If the research is like the, the body of it, like the soul of it is really important as well.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
I'm glad you brought up those other courses because as you were talking, I'm thinking, well, you got Laurie Santos at Yale and Tal Ben-Shahar when he was at Harvard. I think he's doing it with Miami now. And you're seeing these actually starting to pop up in high schools even as well.
Yeah.
I don't know that we even told you, but John and I are both educators and have spent a lot of our careers in schools. So this is something that's flourishing is interesting, but you can't exist in a classroom with teenagers and sit there and think like, oh, this is the best version of how we do this, right?
Yeah.
Like there's more to be had. And I think flourishing hopefully will provide some of those answers.
Yeah. And it sounds like something we could extract from your account and your advice is that there should be greater attention to storytelling in schools, writing stories of your own life. Of course, many students do that in English literature, but kind of perhaps a greater focus on that as one of the means of developing a sense of meaning.
Yeah. And I think that just to go back to the idea of the humanities too, I mean, one way that we make sense of our own story is by reading the stories of others. And there's research that shows that like one of the things that people do as they're reading a novel or watching a movie or whatever, encountering the stories of others, is they're kind of processing their own story through that other story. So I think that in my book, I don't write so much about how, novels and movies and these other forms of storytelling can build meaning, but they can, they do build meaning by helping us with our own stories too.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer to that question. So I understand that you're writing a new book, Emily. At least I read that on your Instagram account. And Nick and I and our listeners would love to hear about this new book you're working on. Could you please tell us about it?
So the new book is about it's kind of a criticism of the success culture, the culture of achievement, and how this preoccupation with success can cause people to lose themselves, to lose their own path. I'm trying to argue that there's a deeper way to understand what it means to be a successful and accomplished human being than just, reaching all those extrinsic goals of fame and money and wealth or whatever. So kind of going back to the great philosophers and psychologists, especially from the 20th century psychologists, what they thought about what, flourishing life, but also like what you need to be like a successful adult. Like, what does that involve? So that's kind of a little preview of the book, I would say.
Wow. And this sounds like it connects up with one of the themes of this book and something we were talking about earlier, that work has become regarded as a source of meaning in the absence of religion, or with declines in religious belief, that's replaced it. Is that something you develop in the book?
Yeah, so that's that. Yeah, definitely. I talk about how I will talk about anyways, how the relationship to work and how the success culture has kind of worked it. There's this place where, we can find meaning. It's important in our paid work and in our unpaid work, the work that we do when we're at home or whatever, that is such a source of meaning. And yet, when things become about like incentives and profit and raises and, promotions, and we're on this kind of rat race in the treadmill and everything, we lose sight of the meaning and kind of get alienated from the work and from ourselves. So I think there's definitely, a story to be told about that.
Absolutely. Very timely. It sounds like. Yeah. Looking forward to seeing that. So,
yeah. And because you're simultaneously doing a PhD, right? So maybe this isn't a question you can answer, but when do you anticipate the book being published?
I don't know. So that is a question that I don't know the answer to quite yet, but hopefully in the next few years.
Okay, what are you pursuing your PhD in?
Clinical psychology.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Where? At
Catholic University.
Okay, great. Mm-hmm. Excellent. So have fun with that. I mean, you've basically already done 2 PhDs by writing this book.
Yeah. Wow. Yes. Okay. So, Nick, do you?
Yeah. Well, we just have a few minutes left, and I referenced this earlier, Emily. You kind of touched on it, but we'll see if we can get 2 for 1 here. So we have kind of a signature question that we ask all of our guests towards the end of the episode, which we just sort of call the flourishing question. Mm-hmm. I referenced it earlier. What might be the one thing that you would suggest to our listeners that they try out in order to create a more flourishing life? Now, you mentioned the journaling piece and storytelling. Mm-hmm. So maybe we'll kind of pick on or tease out some of the other 3 pillars, right? Belonging, purpose, transcendence. What might be a clear action step where you feel like the juice is really worth the squeeze for people to try?
Mm-hmm. I would recommend, making, even if it's just 5 minutes a day for stillness, I'll call it, or for silence, where you just kind of unhook from the phone, from the technology, from all the noise that, takes up, fills our minds, and just be for a few minutes. And I think that taps into a number of the pillars. I think it's a source of transcendence. If we can just kind of, transcendence is kind of just like about stepping away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I think that in those moments of silence and stillness, we do kind of learn about ourselves. So there's introspection there, which helps with purpose and with storytelling. And I think that, being silent and slowing down also, if we practice that skill, it enables us to be more present in our relationships to others, which builds belonging.
Right. Which is the key to just about everything else. This has been a real treat and pleasure for us. As we said earlier, John and I both really loved the book, love your work overall, and are looking forward to the next one. That sounds fantastic.
Well, thank you both so much. This was really great. I really appreciate all the thoughtful questions and hearing your perspectives as well. So thanks for having me.
Thank you.
But again, we're super appreciative of the time.
All right, take care.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear your feedback on that. So your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.